Hey readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're listening to Fictitious, a podcast about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. I'm joined in this episode by author Emily B. Martin. Her new novel, Sunshield, is an adventurous eco-fantasy that weaves together the lives of a desert outlaw, a young ambassador, and a political prisoner. Known as the Sunshield Bandit, a former slave named Lark roams desolate canyons, attacking the wagons of human traffickers and taking from the rich to feed her team and their rescued captives. Translator and minor noble Veran has journeyed to a foreign court in hopes of halting injustices perpetuated by the ruling class, but friendly relations have turned inexplicably hostile. And walled away in a makeshift cell, the battered but not beaten Tamsin must figure out who has stolen her from the most important of responsibilities and how she can escape to right those wrongs. These three beleaguered activists know nothing of each other, but their common goals will intertwine against corrupt politics, brutal slavery, and ecological destruction. Sunshield is available now from Harper Voyager. And Emily, welcome to Fictitious.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
We're having this interview in the time of pandemic, and there's an element of this story that I found entertaining in a weird kind of gallows humorous kind of way, which is that in one section of the story, there is kind of a virus. And a lot of the people, including one of the characters, Veran, is trapped sort of in a royal court where they're all sort of walled in. All the nobility class are never leaving, are all trapped inside and going a little stir crazy, and they're not let out. But then like the servant class, many of whom are these bonded laborers, are the ones that are expected to go out into the outside world where there's a virus. And while this is not a pandemic novel, at the same time, there was a certain kismet in reading that where I was like, oh, well, that feels sort of like what's going on right now. So were you feeling a little prescient? Were you having moments going, oh no, it's all coming true?
Yeah, I mean, this novel, as you can imagine, like most novels, was written, years ago. I started writing it years ago and really just kind of wrapped it up several months ago. And so, yeah, this was all very much pre-COVID-19. And yeah, it's feeling a little like, oh, look at that. The rich and wealthy are closing themselves off in this protected bubble while the, like you said, kind of the bottom rung of society is expected to go out and risk their lives. Yeah. Feeling a little surreal.
Yeah. I've seen so many different authors who have things that touch upon some of the things that we're, kind of going through right now, and all having that same moment of like, I wasn't trying to predict the future and I was really hoping that's not how it would work. But here we are, all the same.
Here we are.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. In my last couple of interviews, as we've talked about these things, I've kind of gotten towards the end of it to talk about sort of the pandemic life. But it feels like a bummer note to end on. So I'm going to start with that in yours. Yeah. And then we're going to swing around more to the story. So I'm curious for you, as somebody who, at the time of this recording, this is still early April, and the book comes out later towards May. So there's hope. I don't know how realistic it is, but some hope that like the new normal that's coming after this will get us back into stores and create a little bit more of a sense of when we can go out into society again. I don't really expect that to happen until maybe early summer, but like we're going to see what happens. So what does that look like for you, both as a writer and creator and as somebody who has a book coming out? Like, what does that look like for you from an industry standpoint?
Yeah, like you, I'm not super optimistic that things will be cleared up by May 26th. But it's definitely changed how I work here at home and my kind of the whole plan for releasing this book. Not the whole plan, but a lot of the plan for releasing this book. I am glad that it's not like my debut novel. I've had 3 books already come out. So my heart goes out to the authors who this is their first release, and they're releasing it in the midst of this, trash fire that is COVID-19. So that being said, I just have had all kinds of emails with my publicist and booksellers and stuff trying to create virtual events and wondering, is anyone going to want to show up to these things, or is anyone going to actually buy the book? So it does create a certain amount of uncertainty. But, you pivot and you do the best you can, I guess, with the mediums that we have, mostly just online interaction. Here at home, I'm one of those parents whose children are now out of school. They're here. I'm homeschooling them. It is a challenge. It's perfect timing for me, too, because my youngest had just started kindergarten this year. So for like the first time in 7 years, I wasn't a stay-at-home mom anymore. I had time back to myself. And now that's pretty much evaporated. So, but again, you work around it, you pivot, and fortunately, we're all at this point pretty good at respecting each other's time and knowing, okay, right now it's mommy's time to work, and the door is closed. I have a sign on my door that says "Go ask Dad." So they know that he's sort of the point parent right now. So yeah, it's just a lot of adapting and just recognizing that there's no way that I'm going to be as productive as I had been before. Just giving myself a little bit more slack in that regard to just productivity is going to be down as long as they're home. And that's okay. Our priority has to be each other. So.
Yeah, I think when everything started, there was this sense of, well, we're going to be locked in. It's time to write that novel or get this thing done or whatever. And like, this is an unprecedented kind of time period. We're not all just working on King Lear here. Like, there's all these different levels of stress and craziness to deal with. And it feels like the situation changes every day. And we also live in a 24-hour news cycle. And if you're on Twitter or Facebook, any of those terrible places, where like you get inundated with just horror every second of the day. It's terrible. Something that was really interesting about your background, that I think is worth touching on because I think it definitely, informs the work, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But I also wonder about in the current situation is in the summer, you say you're a stay-at-home mom, but in the summer you work as a park ranger.
Correct. Yes.
As a park ranger, what does that look like in the current situation?
Yeah, it's pretty depressing. I feel very fortunate this year because I have a family. It impacts my work as a park ranger. Park rangers are highly prized for being able to be very flexible and living in very limited, housing or being able to room with another ranger. And I just can't do that with a family. So because of that, I tend to work every other summer so that we're not having to pick up and move across the country. Past this last year, I was in Yellowstone. We're not having to pick up and move across the country every 6 months. And so this was my summer off. This was going to be my summer here at home. And I'm very grateful for that because I think otherwise I look forward so much to my summers in uniform with the National Park Service. I would be just crushed if that was taken away from me. It's already been taken away from me one summer because of a government sequester that happened. So in a certain sense, you're used to these sort of the way the wind blows up in Washington, D.C., which is never a given. But I am very grateful that this year was my off season. But I'm hearing from lots of other ranger friends who, they were hired for a position back in, February or early March. And now it's like, well, is there even going to be a season? Are we even going to be open during the summer? And a lot of these rangers they work these kind of piecemeal jobs, these seasonal jobs. And so if you're coming up on a season with no job in place, what do you do? How do you handle that? So my heart goes out to them as well. And I'm grateful on my personal end of things that it's not my summer to be in uniform because I would just be so sad to see that fall by the wayside.
Oh my gosh, I can only imagine. I mean, I think about how there's so many things right now that have kind of been postponed or canceled. I mean, I come from the Comic-Con scene, and so all of that stuff washing away is crazy. Yeah. My wife had tickets to see Hamilton here in St. Louis, in a few weeks, and that's gone, all kinds of stuff like that. So, but yeah, when it's like your entire summer, and livelihood, like so many people's livelihood has been massively impacted. So it's definitely a uncertain and scary time. To swing that around into hopefully a more positive direction, you mentioned a little bit ago that you have 3 novels already, the Woodwalker series. And I believe that Sunshield takes place in the same world. It's not necessarily a directly connected story, although there's definitely some family line connections. And I think Woodwalker kind of takes place in some areas that we see mentioned in Sunshield. Correct. Can you kind of give me an idea of how it sort of relates to that series? I mean, I think this is completely a standalone, read it without having to read the previous ones, but people should be encouraged to do so if they are so interested. And tell me a little bit about how the park ranger background has informed these stories.
Yeah, so they are connected. They're in the same universe. Sunshield is set about a generation ahead of Woodwalker and the others, the Creatures of Light trilogy. So there are several children of characters in the Creatures of Light series. In that respect, we're in the same world, but we're seeing different countries, different areas, and then we're following the storylines of 3 entirely new characters, some of whom have connections to the characters in the previous trilogy, but not all. So yeah, it definitely is a standalone novel. I think like many companion novels, you might recognize more characters, you may understand a little bit more of their backstory, but it's not vital to the plot. So you're not going to be like missing big chunks of the plot if you haven't read the Creatures of Light trilogy. But yeah, Woodwalker was my first published novel. It came out, 2016. Oh no. 16, 17, 18. Yeah, it came out 2016. That one is very much kind of a love story to being a park ranger. The main character, May, is a woodwalker. That's her title. And it's basically a ranger. It's basically a forest ranger in kind of the tradition of an Aragorn or something like that, where you're sort of wandering the wilds and keeping an eye on the forest and that kind of thing. So it is very much a quest story. And I love that protagonist a lot. The next two books, she's in the next two books. They're narrated by different characters. So the focus of the story kind of rotates between these three different heroines, but they're all in each other's stories. Sunshield is written a little differently. It also has three protagonists, but they rotate that perspective. So they very much share the spotlight of that story. So yeah, being a ranger, it certainly inspires my settings. This very American-inspired landscape of, in Sunshield, for example, the desert Southwest or the Pacific Northwest, or in Woodwalker, kind of the Southern Appalachia environment. All of the natural phenomena in these books are real things. And many of the characters, too, when I was first publishing Woodwalker, when it was first coming out, I had a couple people ask me, you write all these girl characters kind of doing these traditionally masculine jobs and that kind of thing. Why do you write those characters that way? And in my head, I'm like, this is my reality. These are my colleagues. Not like that I'm writing my colleagues into the story, but I work with women in law enforcement and in, firefighters and EMTs and the women on the end of the sling on the helicopters as they're like, rescuing people in the mountains and stuff. Like I work with these amazing women and men who do just incredible work and so passionate about what they do. So for me, that's like the least fantastic part of these stories. That part isn't a fantasy for me. So yeah, that's really how kind of my work as a ranger really creeps into my stories a lot.
I always wish that people, instead of asking the question of how come more women don't do this thing, or how come you were portraying women as doing this thing, I wish people would ask the question of, how many women do this that I just never see because it's never put in front of me? If you work in any field, you discover it. Yeah.
One of the rangers that I lived right next to this past summer in Yellowstone, she was a law enforcement ranger, and she came back from training. Like I'm an education ranger. So our training is like, here's what the bears are doing this year. And like, here's how you can tell kids about fish or whatever, and she comes back from training and she's like, oh, Emily, look at this. And she like hikes up her shirt and she has bruises from like handprints from where they were doing like combat training, and so she's like learning how to, throw off an attacker or whatever. And you can see the handprints of, bruises on her rib cage. And I was just like, you're the coolest person I know. So like, these are definitely people that I work with and that inspire me a lot, really, really passionate, really tough people. So
the perfect kind of inspiration for fantasy story protagonists, for sure.
Right.
So with Sunshield, then, I gave my description at the top. How do you sell that to people in the sense of your kind of, your short form elevator pitch or whatever? Like, what's the way you describe it to people?
The very kind of like the Twitter pitch, as it were, is a desperate outlaw, a sheltered diplomat, and an imprisoned heretic, or like you said, a political prisoner, find their paths crossing on a quest to expose a system of corruption. So very similar to what you said, these three characters start off, it seems like worlds apart. And over the course of the story, you find their stories intertwining more closely and really coming together for a very common purpose.
This world, when we first get into it, the first character we meet is Lark, the Sunshield Bandit. And the story has a very distinctly Western kind of feel to it. Bandits on horseback, knocking over the stagecoach and liberating the people of their goods and money. And then, you take a step over to Veran and then you see this sort of glass encased royal setting, and the people wear wacky color combinations, which is an important thing that I want to touch on in a minute. He's wearing these like wooden clog shoes that hurt his feet, and it suddenly doesn't feel as Western anymore. Now it feels like courtside intrigue, and it's a very different kind of environment. And then we go off and we see Tamsin, who is the prisoner, and her environment is a different thing too. So tell me more about this world, and in particular, like these various flavors that we're getting and how all those things kind of intertwine. How did you put that together?
Yeah, my hope is that the landscapes are very vivid, and they're absolutely drawn from real places in the United States. So I spent several summers working in the backcountry of New Mexico. And so Lark's, canyon, where her little outlaw operation is very much inspired by a canyon where I spent my whole summer kind of living and working in New Mexico. And then, you travel up to Mokoya, and it's more of a sort of Pacific Northwest, the big trees and the rugged coastline and, rainy and cloudy and very dense forests and that sort of thing. But like you said, the main action kind of takes place in this very opulent, closed-in palace. I really liked that juxtaposition of having these two very lush environments in their own way, I guess rugged environments in their own way, but the action in this one, we get more into the wilderness in book 2 in Mokoya, but for this one, most of the action takes place in that palace. So the idea of having this beautiful, rugged landscape, but where, the wealthy, powerful class has really just decided to kind of close themselves up and put much more weight and much more influence in sort of the artifice of their environment. So it all, I think, comes back to the natural environment. And even Tamsin, who most of her story takes place within the same four walls, most of the things that she notes and her, the way she connects with the world outside her tiny little window is in the natural things she sees, the changing of the sky, the swarms of bats that swarm by her window every night. So that's really the connecting thread through most of these. And I think Veran being placed in the palace in this sort of closed in, bubble, if you will, comes from a country that very heavily reveres their natural world. And so he's constantly he feels like a fish in a glass bowl, looking out at these gorgeous forests and what's going on? How come this court is this way? What's happening? What's the undercurrent here that's keeping people kind of locked in beyond just, like you said, the threat of this mosquito-borne virus? That's kind of the physicality of it, but even just the mentality of we just don't go outside kind of thing. That was a lot of fun to play with.
You were talking about the Mokoyan culture there, and so that his story is taking place inside this this fishbowl of politics, essentially, of which he is very much an outsider on the inside, experiencing these things. I'm going to hit the character stuff harder later on, but I would like to know, kind of bringing in an outsider character to experience this space. It gives you very much like a bit of an avatar for the audience. So can you talk about that a little bit more about the Mokoyan culture? And in particular, they've got this really distinct relationship with color, which I found really fascinating, and that Veran finds very vexing at moments. Also, yeah. I mean, it's of immense curiosity. He wants to know more and more, but you're trying to take in a whole lot of cultural elements from a group of people who are not necessarily great at explaining themselves about it.
Yeah. So Veran does give a very good kind of window character. He's sort of the exposition character where if we need to figure something out, he's going to figure it out for us because he doesn't know either. And so that's a very beneficial character just to have in any story of, the audience is going to have questions. Who's going to answer it for them? So he was a really helpful character in that way. Yeah, the color, the emphasis on color really stemmed once again from the natural world, and it doesn't come into play in Sunshield as much as it does in my original trilogy, but the sort of spiritual entity in this world is called the Light, capital L, the Light. It's the same kind of entity from country to country, but every country perceives it slightly differently. So Veran's country, the Silverwood Mountains, which again is based on sort of this southern Appalachia kind of mountainous region, they see the light in fireflies. And this is a place that it's a kind of a sacred thing for them. When it's firefly season in the summer, there's festivals and there are beliefs about the nature of the light based on fireflies, and everything that he experiences and sees. These are real things in our own world, which is just something that is really, really cool and really special for me, is to bring in these, instead of having like a magic system, it's really the natural world that's really giving the sense of fantasy to these stories, these books. And then as we move into other countries, so for example, Alcloro, which is where the desert is in Sunshield, doesn't come into play much in this book, but they revere the stars. And if you've ever been out west, you go out into the middle of the desert and, night falls, and you just have these massive starscapes that are so awe-inspiring. And I remember my first journey out west, being from the East Coast, where it's just, more humid, but also hazier, more light pollution. You get out west and you see these incredible starscapes, so many that you never even knew existed. For me, it's so hard not to feel some kind of spiritual connection, to what's going on up in the sky. So that made a lot of sense for Alcoro, to have this, they see the light in the stars, and that comes in a lot in the first trilogy. For Mokoya, as I was getting over to that country and developing it a little bit more, I was like, well, we're in sort of a, cloudy kind of temperate rainforest area. You've got a lot of moisture. Where are they seeing the light? Where are they perceiving this spiritual entity? And it struck me that, rainbows are a semblance of the light as well. And this is something that would be very special because it's so fleeting. It happens so quickly and it's over so quickly in some cases, and you can never predict when it's going to happen. And so it would be something that would be really this kind of momentous event that would take precedence over everything else when it happens. And so that's, I think, where that system of color, creating sort of a structural hierarchy from that, that's really where that stemmed from. So all of a sudden now you have color kind of seeping into how people title themselves, how people communicate their business intentions or their political leanings based on what are they wearing. And you have these, I also wanted it to lead into a very rigid society, a very structured society, to where if it's the first of Makansi, which is the month of turquoise, you wouldn't be caught dead wearing a color other than turquoise on the first day of the month. It's just not what you do. It's something that it's not even thought of to wear a color other than turquoise at the beginning of that month. And so, yeah, those are the nuances that Veran is really having to navigate. And not even just, it's not enough to just say, okay, well, I'm wearing a shade of turquoise. It's like, but is it a dark turquoise? Are you pairing it with other accents? Who are you trying to mirror in court that you're sending kind of signals, or you're showing that you're allied with this person? Yeah, I think it's very fascinating to him, but it's also just like frustrating. Like, what is in my way? Why am I not being able to accomplish the things I want to accomplish? And what's going on here? Just being very bewildered by this opulent, colorful, but very mysterious court.
It's funny to read something like that in a time period where, I haven't really worn pants in 3 weeks. And then to have this character going through a society, like you said, where like every choice of their clothing, and we see this through Tamsin's eyes later as we learn about her background, how, that exploration of how every one of those little elements is absolutely scrutinized and matters within a nonverbal communication of the court. I like how the characters have these additional titles to their names, like in Azure, in Chartreuse, things like that, where like it's not, they're not stuck to the basic crayon colors. They're really into the into shades and tints and what all of those things mean to people. So I really, really like that aspect of things. On the flip side of it is that there is definitely bonded labor, which is slavery. It's human trafficking. There are people who are stolen, as children and then forced into this work. There's other kind of bonded labor where people can sort of volunteer themselves into it, indentured servitude, essentially, in order to overcome debt or, if they're an orphan or something like that. So I want to know, like, how does that work itself into this world? And then in particular, the cultures that perpetuate it. How do you portray that? Because it's certainly a sensitive kind of subject to tackle at any time. So yeah, how did you approach that?
Yeah, it is a very sensitive subject, and it sounds so naive now, but when I started out, I was like, oh, it won't be that big of a thing, or it won't be that dark in the story. And then I was like, I'm writing about human trafficking. Like, this is getting dark. And it actually stemmed from when I very first conceived of this story. I think I had just finished reading Lee Bardugo's Siege and Storm, where there's like pirates and stuff. And I'm really I love sea epics and I love pirate stories. And so originally this book was conceived as like a sea epic, like a piracy book. But I'm also really, really intimidated by sea epics because I don't know, it's kind of a silly thing. I have this weird complex where like if I have no background in something, I'm like, well, I've never sailed a tall ship. Like I can't write about that. And then you step back and you're like, well, who really has actually sailed a tall ship themselves? But at the time, this was 5 years ago. And I was a ranger in Yellowstone at that time. And it took me a couple days, but finally I was like, hang on. I don't feel quite right writing a sea epic or like a piracy story, but I've spent years living and working in the American Southwest, and here I am in sort of the Rocky Mountains, and what if she's an outlaw and not a pirate? And so that's really where it had its start. So part of it was like the idea of like a crew on a ship sort of being press ganged, and they're essentially indentured servants being held prisoner on this ship, and which is, where you have people deserting ship or whatever. And so that's kind of where it got its start, but it really started growing as I took more of a look around our own society. And living where I live very close to what is one of the most heavily human trafficked corridors in the United States. The I-85 corridor near Atlanta it's a real scourge in this area. And I don't want to say it's like super prevalent, but there's signage in different places of like, here's what you look out for. And they train truckers on, here's what to look for. If you think someone is being trafficked, here's the number to call. It's a reality in this area. And then beyond that, beyond just the kind of mechanics of human trafficking, just looking at the structure of our society. And we're seeing it now, like you said, with the wealthy and the powerful being able to afford to kind of wall themselves up and turn to look the other way from what their power is actually built on. And the idea that our system is built on a collection of people without whom our society would essentially collapse. And yet we are able to put them on like the lowest rung of our social ladder. Right. And right now that feels really painful, very, very prevalent to look at, especially as, this pandemic is really just kind of very much illuminating the weaknesses in our society that have always been there, but really shining a spotlight on those things. And so it feels very, very present right now to be writing. I'd like to think it doesn't get preachy in the book, but definitely writing a reflection of our own society where you have people who have made their millions on the backs of other people and feel very little responsibility to those people under them. So it really became something that I had to be very sensitive to, because I would hope that someone would read these sections on Mokoya and be like, wow, that's terrible. Like, how could a society, live with themselves or operate that way? And then, maybe at some point, maybe not right away, but at some point you think, hold on, like that's our reality as well. And so a lot of that too was born out of frustration. A lot of my environmental messaging is born out of frustration as well, where it's like, the days where I feel absolutely helpless or it's like, our world is on fire. What do I do? Like I have I can only call my senators so many times or whatever. And so oftentimes sitting down and just like writing 500 words on this manuscript was the way that I dealt with some of that frustration. So yeah, it's definitely a very sensitive topic, and one that I had to be very aware of how I was writing and where I was pulling that inspiration from.
You mentioned earlier that this story has 3 distinct POVs. It's also, they're all first-person POVs. And I think most of the time we're used to a novel that's, at least more of the things I encounter, although it seems to be changing lately, usually a first-person POV is the POV of the story. With 3, now I want to definitely hit here that these are very distinct voices. Even if you didn't have names at the beginning of each chapter, which is very kind of you to put there, but even if they were not there, you would very easily be able to tell who each of these characters are. And that's not always the case in some novels. These voices are very distinct, but I do want to know why you made the choice to do them as first-person narrators and when you had 3 separate characters as your POVs. I
wrote my first trilogy in first person point of view, and that was past tense. So I said, she said, we said, whatever. This one isn't only first person, it's also present tense. So I say, I go, I ride, I run, whatever, which was a switch for me. And I can't say exactly why I made that decision, except that, so Lark, with, her sort of bandit title, the Sunshield Bandit being the title of the book, there are these three protagonists, but I think Lark is really sort of the lead protagonist. And it's her that really the story kind of revolves around. It seemed to be a good fit for her. She's very much a living in the present kind of person. She has to, how am I going to get from today to tomorrow? How am I going to sustain the other kids in my camp from today to tomorrow? What's happening right now that is going to affect me? That's the only thing I can really point to as why it felt like this first person present tense point of view was the right way to go. And then, I think because the characters were so different, that it lent itself more to being a rotating first person point of view. It did give me some trouble when I would hop over into another manuscript, which is third person past tense. And so I would make that switch and I'd just sort of sit staring at my screen and being like, who's saying what? I don't know what's happening. So that was the only time it really gave me trouble. But I think the nature of Lark's character and the fact that they are all so different and from different backgrounds really lent itself to this rotating first person present tense point of view.
Can you tell me more about Lark? Like you said, this is a character who's essentially the titular character of the story and is kind of our primary protagonist. And I don't think we've talked enough about her. So can you kind of talk about like who she is, what motivates her, who her allies are, and kind of how she ended up being this persona, this Sunshield Bandit?
Yeah, so she's an escaped slave, and my first kind of inclination for her was to be sort of this Robin Hood character of sweeping in, kind of turning over these stagecoaches or these slave wagons and rescuing usually the kids, but the slaves inside, and then if possible, returning them to their families, which doesn't always happen. So she has this camp full of kids in the wilderness, the desert, basically. That is really what drives her desire to free these captives and really do as much as she can in her own way to disrupt this slaving operation in the Veran desert. And she feels very close to the kids in her camp. And it can be really fun to write these sort of outlaw operations. I think of like the Lost Boys in Peter Pan, or the Freedom Fighters in Avatar: The Last Airbender, or whatever, where you have these camps of kids in the woods who are, it's fun to create these little societies of, their tree houses and their cunning plans and that kind of thing. But I wanted to go, I don't know, kind of a little bit grimmer and grittier with Lark's camp, because it's not just a kind of a bunch of kids in the wilderness, playing at make-believe. Like they're out there surviving. And so many of the kids that she has, there are a couple older kids like Lark, she's kind of the leader, and then she has some older kids who help her, but then she has several younger ones as well. And many of them are sick or they're hungry. And, this is a really harsh environment to try to survive in. And so I wanted to bring a little bit more of the reality of, maybe it's not just a group of kids kind of having fun in their treehouse. It's like, this is survival. And these are little kids, and their circumstances are quite desperate. And it's a cycle, right? As the more desperate she gets, the further away this hope of maybe returning some of these kids to family or securing. I think she has this sense of like, if I can just turn over one more stagecoach or, rob someone who's rich enough or just achieve this one thing, then we'll be set, we'll be fine. And maybe she doesn't actually believe that, but I think that's probably what she tells herself. And so she really has this kind of one day at a time mentality. I think in some ways she just knows, she can feel the world kind of closing in around her, the sheriff from town getting closer on her trail and, the bounty on her head getting higher and higher. And that's where she is in this story, is the world is definitely closing in very, very quickly on her.
There's a moment where she's got some time with her own thoughts, and she kind of talks about that the anticipation of a good thing is better than the thing itself, and that the experience of the thing itself eventually gives way back to reality or diminishes in some way. And so she kind of almost prefers the looking forward to something good than the good thing actually arriving. And I think that lines up with some of the stuff that you were talking about there.
Yep.
For Veran and for Tamsin, I want to be mindful of not giving too much away with these characters and spoiling too much about them, but has some interesting elements that affect the way he interfaces with both his own people and with this foreign government. Tamsin has a really important role that she's being held back from. What can you tell us about those things without giving more away than you feel comfortable?
Yeah, sure. Veran comes from the country, the Silverwood Mountains. That's the kind of primary focus of my first book, Woodwalker. And he comes from a culture and from a family in particular that's very connected to their natural world, the forest. His mother is a woodwalker. She's a forest ranger. She's very much plugged into the health and the safety and security of the forest and its natural processes. And for a variety of reasons, Veran has not been able to achieve that same status, that same sort of connection to the natural world. And that really kind of eats away at him because he really wants it. That really forms the basis of a lot of his motivation of feeling just not quite good enough. And I think that comes into play too with the other ambassadors that he's with in court. So he's with Rue, who readers of Creatures of Light trilogy will recognize. He comes in the second book, and Rue's daughter, Rue and Queen Mona's daughter, Eloise. And I think he thinks very highly of both of them to the point of almost reverence. I think he thinks they're very capable, and he's the translator. He's basically the linguist in their team. And I think just feeling like he needs to be able to make his mark in some way is really what drives him a lot. And so I think he's frustrated at many turns by just feeling like he's not able to achieve what he wants to achieve. And, he's already, he probably feels like he's already failed at his main goal in life, which is to kind of be like his mom and be this sort of rugged ranger type character. And so I think he's becoming increasingly desperate as he's stymied at every turn, it seems, in the court, making any kind of progress there. And then, Tamsin, I was a little daunted by her at first because she's a prisoner, and few things are harder to write than a character who's stuck inside the same four walls for most of the story. How do you make that character interesting? How do you make their story dynamic? And right out of the gate, she had this wit to her voice, this humor that really came through, and it was this lens with how she perceived this really terrible situation that she's in. She's captive, she's wounded, things are looking very bleak for her. And when I started writing this story, I would have thought that Lark would have been kind of my snarky character, like my sarcastic kind of character, maybe the wisecracking character. And she really wasn't. Lark has turned out to be this very stoic, if she's exhibiting any sense of humor, it's usually with people she feels closest to, which is not many people. And so she's a very grim, determined character to a point. And she's got some lighthearted points too. But Tamsin was the one who just kind of burst out of the gate with this sense of humor. That's kind of this dry, sort of wry sense of humor that really lends itself to not making her story as bleak and honestly maybe as boring as it may have been otherwise. It really lends, I think, some life to her character that I was worried I wasn't going to be able to achieve, just kind of her being trapped in the same four walls.
And then I want to know about your writing process. Are you an outliner, a pantser, a combination of the in-between? What's that creative process look like for you?
Yeah, I am absolutely a plotter. The few things will paralyze me quicker than having no plan at all, which I think to some people feels very rigid and structured. But for me, if I don't have the skeleton of the story in place, it's almost overwhelming because it's like you come to a crossroads and it's like the story could go in any direction. And if I don't have an idea of where this story could go, I have no idea what to do with myself. So I definitely like to outline. I'm also an artist, and so I have sketchbooks upon sketchbooks. Most of my characters appear as sketches years before they appear. I write down any of their stories. So I always have these notebooks and these sketchbooks. I like to have timelines of when different things happen. I once turned an outline into my agent that was 9 pages long. She was like, Emily, I feel like you've written the book. Like you've handed, I have it here in my hands. You've written me the book. So I definitely am a plotter. Not to say that I won't, if there's kind of a thread that seems like I should follow it, that I won't follow that thread. But I do like to have the structure in place, and that gives me the room, the creativity within that structure to then play around with dialogue and action and backstory. And very frequently I revise that. The outline that I write at the beginning, at the outset, never looks the same as the outline at the very end. So of course it changes and the structure changes over time. But yeah, I definitely am a plotter, and I'm not afraid to admit it.
Do you have any specific like kind of structure that you adhere to, like a 3-act structure or a 7-point or a 15, any of those kinds of things?
Yeah, I really like Jessica Brody's Save the Cat Writes a Novel. So her beat sheets, that really kind of revolutionized my my plotting. And I really like identifying the different places in my stories where, what is the catalyst of this story? What is I think probably the most significant point that I've identified is the all is lost moment. Like, what is the lowest that I can bring this character? And that for me, having that moment at the end of towards the end of the last third or whatever of the book where everything seems like it's as bad as it can go. What is that point for that character? And so then how do I get them there? And how do I build them up in the beginning and then just kind of break them down to that point and then rebuild them into something that they never thought they could accomplish in the end. And that I really like that structure. That's really helped with my plotting process, and I highly recommend that book.
I really like what Jessica Brody did with the Save the Cat Writes a Novel, that extrapolation of Blake Snyder's original, film version, which is a great usable thing on its own. I mean, and really she's just elaborating on it for novelists, but that particular book is super, super helpful. And I love that you brought that up. And then what do you write in?
Just Microsoft Word, nothing fancy. I have kind of a system I usually have 2 documents open at a time, which is my manuscript document and then my discarded passages document. And that's where I just keep, if something's not working, I just take it all out, copy and paste it into that discarded passages document. And often towards the end of the story, I'll go back through that document and realize there are still sort of nuggets in there that I can use, and that were kind of good ideas, but maybe just didn't manifest quite right. So, but yeah, just Microsoft Word. I use Adobe Photoshop for my artwork, which really helps when I'm developing characters and their visual, what they look like, what are they wearing, and that kind of thing. But yeah, for the writing, it's just Word.
I think you might be one of the first people on this show to really talk about how you are an artist and a writer and how that affects things, because I think when you do have a visual imagination like that and you are an artist, you can explore your ideas in a very different way. Do you do a lot of analog stuff too, or are you mostly a digital artist, and how much does that inform your work?
A character is probably going to appear in a sketchbook as a rough sketch first. And I also make notes. I'll carry around a small notebook or something where I'm making notes and character sketches and that kind of thing. And that's really where a lot of my stories have their beginnings. But there comes a point as I'm writing the story where I have to have like a colored, detailed picture of that character. And I had some people cosplay some of my characters, which was really fun. And then they were like, well, what is she wearing at this point in time? And I'm like, oh, this is a lot of fun. So I did some wardrobe lineups, which were really helpful because then I can look at different details of their wardrobe and then figure out how to describe them, really paint a picture for people in the manuscript. There's a character right now in one of my manuscripts that I'm working on who she just had sort of a costume change, and it's an outfit that she's going to be in for most of the rest of the book. So it's important for me to really create a visual image for the reader. And I'm not sure what she's wearing yet because I haven't gotten to sit down and like draw her out and figure out, does that jacket really work with that dress or whatever? And so it's not really, I've kind of skipped over that section for now. And it's not until I get a good colored image of her on my digital medium that I'm really going to be able to describe that outfit to the readers.
And then as people discover you, whether through this work or knew it from the previous trilogy and the new things you have going, you've mentioned this is the first book of an ongoing series as well, right? Is this another trilogy too?
Duology. Mm-hmm.
Duology, like the new cool thing in publishing.
Yeah, right.
Where should people be finding your work online?
So I post a lot on Instagram, and that's at Emily B.Bee Martin. So EMILY BEE MARTIN. That's my handle for Twitter and Facebook as well. Instagram is kind of my favorite spot because most of the stuff that I post is so visual. I post a lot of artwork, a lot of character pieces, but then a lot of fan art of books and stuff that I'm reading too. So that's where I concentrate a lot of my effort. But I am on Facebook and I am on Twitter. I go through spurts on Twitter, like kind of trying to avoid it right now because it's just terrible and it makes me really depressed. Yeah. But it is a good place. It is a good place to network and that kind of thing. So I am relatively active on there. And then my website, I put up a blog post every month. So I have a monthly blog, and that I rotate that for writers, for artists, and then for readers of my work. So kind of different types of posts aimed at different people who might be interested in things. So, and that's emilybmartin.net. Just a single B in that name, no buzzy bee.
I want to say one of the things that I really liked about this novel is that it is accessible right off the bat. I feel like sometimes, especially in like sort of fantasy and sci-fi novels, there will be times where it takes me a couple of chapters to get a sense of who the characters are or to get a feel for the world or whatever it is. And I felt like I was like 2 paragraphs in and I was already comfortable in this. Like I already understood Lark as a character. I already had a feel for the world, and maybe because I dig Western stuff and particularly as it appears in other things. And so right off, I was like, cool, I'm into this. And immediately meeting Veran, I was like, oh, I like this guy. And I met Tamsin, I was like, oh, this person's fascinating. So at every step of the way, I felt like there was never any kind of barrier to get into this world. And in a time period where it's honestly, it's hard for me to read right now, like because of everything in the world, like, and all the things occupying my headspace. Sometimes, you know, there's some friction in getting into fiction. I didn't mean that for it to rhyme, but you know,
well done.
Yeah, you know, there can be a little bit of a barrier. And this particular story, I didn't feel that at all. It was really easy for me to slide into the worn out boots of Lark and to the awfully uncomfortable clogs of Veran and to get a sense of all that. So yeah, I really appreciated that. And I think this is an excellent novel, and I'm excited for people to get a chance to read it out on the open market. So like I said, Sunshield coming out here very soon. And Emily, thank you so much for joining me on Fictitious.
Thank you.
This has been Season 5, Episode 7 of Fictitious. Listen and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or search for the show using your favorite podcasting app. You can also find a full archive of every episode at fictitiouspodcast.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it on your social profiles, tell all your book-loving friends, or hell, even write a review. All of it supports the authors who appear on the program and helps me to grow the podcast. If you'd like to financially support my work with Fictitious, there are 2 great ways to do so: Patreon and Ko-Fi. Patreon subscribers receive patron-exclusive content, including video blogs and mini-podcasts. Accompanying this episode is an additional chat with Emily B. Martin, available only to Patreon supporters. To join, go to fictitiouspodcast.com/Patreon. You can also make a one-time donation using Ko-Fi. It's fast and easy and very much appreciated. Go to fictitiouspodcast.com/Ko-Fi to get started, and Ko-Fi is K-O-F-I. My next interview features Martha Wells, author of The Murderbot Diaries. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. I'm Adrian Buskey. Thanks for listening to Fictitious.